Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. Life is a story we tell ourselves. On this podcast episode, we are joined by Emily Douce. Emily is the Deputy Vice President for Government Affairs at the National Park and Conservation Association. Emily helps manage the department at NPCA that advocates for additional funding for national parks, both through appropriations and supplementary sources. So on the program today, we're going to be talking a lot about the funding or lack of enough funding for national parks with Emily. Emily's been instrumental in helping secure additional funding for national parks with the passage of the National Park Service Centennial Act, the Great American Outdoors Act, and National Park Transit and Transportation funding through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. She has also led the change to oppose administration proposals that seek to drastically increase national park entrance fees. She leads the National Park Second Century Action Coalition, comprised of travel and tourism, outdoor industry, conservation, and historic preservation groups, to advocate for additional park funding with Congress and the administration. She has a master's degree in environmental resource policy from the George Washington University and a BS from Texas A&M University. Prior to working for NPCA, she worked at the Marine Conservation Institute on ocean conservation issues. So, Emily, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to start off by giving people a flavor and understanding of what a great organization NPCA is, going back to almost the turn of the century, at least until 1917. Robert Sterling Yard was the first executive director of NPCA, which started off as the National Park Association. And there are some storied and prominent people that were involved in the founding of NPCA. We won't go into all of that detail, but Robert Yard was certainly an important figure in that. And one interesting thing about one person making a difference, Robert Sterling Yard was for a long time the only staff member for NPA, which is now NPCA. And he led that organization for a number of years all by himself. So this is a quote from Robert Sterling Yard. He says, "The association work does not overlap that of the Department of Interior. It begins where the government function ceases. For Congress provides only for the physical development of our national parks. Their enormous value to popular education, to the increased pleasure which comes only with understanding, to the outdoor living, and to the travel in America is left for the people to develop. It is to help reap this important harvest and to bring together in a common endeavor the helpful citizens of every part of the land that the National Parks Association was founded. Its opportunity, however, is much greater, and the association is availing of this to the full. Unconnected with the government and absolutely independent of political or otherwise adverse influences, it has become the fearless and outspoken defender of the people's parks and the wildlife within them against the constant and just now the very dangerous assaults of commercial interests," unquote. And that's very true today. And I can say, from having been involved with NPCA as a board member for a number of years back in the 90s, that NPCA does absolutely fantastic work, and many of the reasons for the foundation of the National Parks Conservation Association are existent today. So, Emily, I want our visitors or listeners to get to know you. So on our podcast, we are interested to hear how your journey began with national parks. Was there a specific moment when you knew you wanted to be involved with our national parks?
Yes, thank you so much again for having me. I started my time just loving the outdoors. I grew up in the state of Texas, and I spent a lot of time outdoors, and I just fell in love with being outdoors. I went to college to do actually marine biology down at Texas A&M at Galveston to study the ocean life. And as I was there, I loved the science and I loved being outdoors, but I also realized that I wanted to see what they were doing with the science. Were they trying to influence policy? And a lot of my professors said, sometimes. And I said, oh, we need to change that. So I started to get into policy, and I've always been interested in politics. And so I went and got my graduate degree at George Washington University in public policy for the environment. And I got my policy degree so that I could take my science background and push on policy. But with national parks, I didn't spend a lot of time in national parks growing up, but I spent a lot of time in state parks and local parks. And then in college, I just fell in love with camping, and I just started to really enjoy the national parks. But I also really enjoyed our national marine sanctuaries and our other marine protected areas. And when I was at Marine Conservation Institute, I helped during the Bush administration help protect some of the islands out in the Pacific. I helped do some conservation work on the Hawaiian monk seal. I worked on marine protected areas and so forth. And as part of that, I worked in coalition with land groups as well. And so I got involved with national parks as well. And so they're all connected. And I've continued my work for the last 10 years on national park issues, which has been just a joy.
How did you end up joining NPCA? Were you recruited, or did you ask to be part of the organization?
I worked in coalition with NPCA, and my former boss, who worked for NPCA as the VP of Government Affairs, came from there. And so he told me how much he enjoyed working for NPCA. And then there was a job opening, and so I jumped at it, and I haven't looked back. I loved working for Marine Conservation Institute, but I also love working for NPCA.
Understand. So now what's your role at NPC? I gave a little bit of introduction that you're involved with helping make sure the National Park Service gets the funding it needs, but what role do you play, and what do you do from day to day to make that happen?
Yeah, that was a good summary of the work that I do. I was brought on to put together that coalition, the Second Century Action Coalition, right at the centennial of the Park Service, and to bring like-minded people together that really love our national parks to see if we could get some additional funding for the parks around the centennial. So I worked on that and built that coalition up, and it's still growing and strong as ever as we continue to get more and more funding through that coalition and working together in a bipartisan way. So I worked on the Centennial Bill, and then I've worked on the Great American Outdoors Act, and then transportation funding. A lot of people don't realize that parks actually really benefit from funding through the transportation bill. So I work on those policies in partnership with other colleagues on our team, and then just continue to advocate for others to join our efforts and push forward. And so my day-to-day is working with Congress to make sure that they realize the impacts that they make on the votes that they take, and that our national parks are very much loved. And all the members of Congress love our parks, they say, and it's true, they do. And so we ensure that they are taking the right steps to make sure that those parks are protected.
Well, I'm going to come back to that part about the members of Congress really love parks, because despite their love for parks, and I don't doubt that they do, national parks still remains underfunded as a result of some of the budgets and that the Congress puts together and the administration. But you mentioned something I want to circle back to, and that's the Great Americans Outdoors Act, because there's quite a bit of funding provided for federal agencies, national parks in particular, for the maintenance backlog, something I worked on when I was Deputy Director of the National Park Service, by developing the Facility Condition Index, which was supposed to be a very objective way of communicating to members for the parks were as far as the maintenance backlog was concerned. So what's been the result so far of funding from the Great American Outdoors Act? Has the National Park Service benefited?
Yeah, let me give you a little bit of background on the actual piece of legislation, the act that went through. 2020, we were able to work with Congress to pass this historic bipartisan Great American Outdoors Act to provide both permanent funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund to assist parks and other public lands in the acquisition of essential lands from willing sellers, and to provide states with money to invest in local conservation efforts and recreation opportunities. It also established the National Parks and Public Lands Legacy Restoration Fund, we call it the Legacy Restoration Fund, to dedicate $6.65 billion over 5 years for our national parks and other public lands. So, sorry, just national parks. $9.5 billion for total for other agencies as well, like the Forest Service and BLM and so forth.
So if I understand you, that was 5.6 billion, did you say?
6.65 billion for parks specifically.
6.65 billion. Yeah, our listeners should know that number.
Over 5 years. So we're several years into it. And over the last 3 years, the next tranche of projects were just released with the passage of the appropriations bill. But the last 3 years, $4 billion for the parks have funded over 100 large-scale projects and 270 smaller historic preservation projects throughout most of the states, as well as Washington, D.C., and 2 U.S. territories. We have been told by the end of the 5 years, every state will be touched, every territory, and the district. So that's great. And the Park Service, according to the Park Service, that has contributed $1.8 billion in economic output and 17,000 jobs from that work, from restoring these really great places. So that goes from, the hot springs in Arkansas, the bathhouses are being restored, the campgrounds at Yosemite and Mount Rainier National Parks are being restored. Great Basin National Park, their water systems are being restored. So some really great projects, both big, medium, and small throughout the country are being addressed. Much more is needed, but it's a really great investment. So to some of these parks that have been, the infrastructure was built such a long time ago, and there just needs some love and attention to restore them so that visitors continue to have great experiences.
Yeah, some of those projects are restoring many of the WPA projects that were done a very long time ago, and we're in dire need of restoration, and really happy to hear that. A little bit more history about the Great American Outdoors Act that you may or may not know. Back in the 90s, we worked very hard to also revitalize the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and we had an act that passed the Congress but did not pass in the Senate, and there were many people who worked very hard on that 30 years ago. I only bring it up because you and others are to be commended for not giving up and picking up that torch to continue to work for revitalization of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And that fund continues to be funded by Outer Continental Shelf oil royalties, which makes all the difference in the world. And if I'm not mistaken, the Great American Outdoors Act ended up making that a permanent fund. Is that correct in the legislation?
Correct. It was quite the effort, and kudos to the work that was done before us to get that start. Legislation, as you know, takes a long time, and it takes the squeaky wheels to keep the attention on it, and showing the successes of the money that was going through on the Land and Water Conservation Fund that really just got people's attention. But yes, permanent funding and forever. It's indefinite, which is a huge, huge win.
Oh, that's absolutely true. And again, congratulations to all of you that worked so hard on that. And it took a very broad coalition, and it just speaks to the fact that when people work together and pull together for a common cause, what can happen. And your organization is, of course, working to make sure citizens are aware of that and are continuing to work on behalf of our national parks. I wanted to ask you also a little bit about so the funding, or what's often characterized as the underfunding of our national parks, has been an issue for decades. So I'm wondering what has been some of the strategies employed in the past to increase national park funding. We just talked about the Great Americans Outdoors Act, but every time we get around to budget time, it seems that we're still fighting tooth and nail just to get the basic funding that parks need. So what are some of the strategies we're developing to change that, or will we be fighting forever every year to make sure parks gets its fair share of funding?
Yeah, it is. It's a constant squeaky wheel of just making sure that Congress knows how their annual budgeting process, they have to continue to provide more and more funding for our national parks and other things. There's so many priorities in this country, and there's so many different views from the members of Congress and it changes all the time, as we all know. So we just have to continue to raise attention to why these places are so special, what the economic output is, and how important they are to local communities for jobs and local businesses. And we continue to talk about that economic message, but we also talk about, that during the pandemic, everybody flocked to our public lands. And so we remind people about how loved these places are, but as they're loved, they also need additional staffing to help with the visitors, and they need additional staffing or resources to upgrade or just restore some of these old buildings and roads and the trials that these parks have from people just really enjoying our national parks, which they should be doing. The other thing is climate change. Climate change is changing our environments, and wildfires and flooding, they're impacting our national parks as well as local communities. And so more resources are needed to address and let these parks adapt, and for these professionals in our parks to figure out what to do and to restore. The floods in Yellowstone a couple of years ago really impacted that park and shut things down. And it takes a lot of money to restore those roads that had been washed out and the impacts there. So we just continue to just raise the attention of the needs, and it's an ebb and flow. And the stars have to align, have the right people in the right places to really get some stuff done. But we've had some successes in previous years, and we continue to hope to have some more successes, even in a very divisive, difficult Congress.
Yeah, I understand. So speaking of Yellowstone and the floods that were there, was emergency funding provided? Did FEMA get involved? Did the National Park Service get additional funding to help with the restoration of areas and the cleanup, and especially with restoring some of the park housing that was destroyed?
Yes, they're underway restoring a lot of the roads in particular that were destroyed. And there's an emergency fund through the Department of Transportation that the parks were able to tap into to help restore or in the process of restoring those lost roads. But yes, there was, Yellowstone being the iconic first national park unit certainly got some attention, but there's other parks that are also impacted, Death Valley and Yosemite and others that are having issues with the climate change as well. So, comes from all sorts of different sources, but we've got to cobble all of that money together and work to make sure Congress is aware of these needs. So sometimes Congress is able to help, sometimes they are unable to help.
Understand. So what's the current budget of the National Park Service, and what does the future of national park funding look like?
Yeah, Congress just passed, after 6 months, the FY24 budget for the Park Service. And it was unfortunately a $150 million cut to the Park Service overall. The House of Representatives was proposing a $433 million cut. So we were able to push back, and really we worked very hard to try to reduce those costs or those cuts to the Park Service. But, it's not looking good with the debt deal that went through. They have another series of top level funding that they have to abide by, that the administration and Congress has come to an agreement on. And it's not it's not looking good. Congress is setting a course to go backwards. The parks, over time, NPCA and others have been pushing and slowly increasing those dollars to help the parks to deal with the increased visitation, to deal with climate change and so forth. But $150 million cut on top of the needs of the parks and the staffing is going backwards. And how can we expect our parks to meet their mission and safely welcome millions of visitors with less money and a continued threat to cut? So we are pushing Congress to prioritize and invest more in these treasured places and not less. So we will continue to advocate for increased funding for our parks. And it's going to be a hard slog this go around, but we'll continue to raise the profile and the need.
So give our listeners an understanding of what some of the reasons that are given by members of Congress for these cuts. I mean, when you go to the different resources committees in both the Senate and the House of Representatives, and of course, the budget offices, OMB, what are the possible reasons they give for cutting funding from parks when it's very clear that parks are underfunded and in dire need of more funding, or at least the funding in a very objective sense that the parks need? What possible reasons do they give?
They make it bigger than the national parks. They talk about the overall investment in our federal budget and how much we can actually afford as a nation. So they go very top level with us about the prioritization of our needs for this country and that we're overspending more than we have as a nation. And we are not in the business of telling them to say, don't fund healthcare, you should be funding national parks. We don't want to be in that business. We want to raise all the priorities of this nation that make sense for our nation. So we continue to hammer that, and we have been successful. Like I said, we had the $433 million proposed cut that we were able to at least reduce down to 150, which is still not great. But we are resonating with some members of Congress, particularly on the Democratic side, but even on the Republican side, that wait, those cuts are a little bit too much for the places that we love. And so we'll continue to fight that, but it's bigger than national parks. It's the overall just discourse on Capitol Hill.
Understood, but what I think our listeners need to understand is that these are cuts from previous amounts that were given to the National Park Service. So it's not like, oh, we're spending too much money on parks. It's more like, right, oh, let's cut what we already know we need. And therein lies the problem. So I think National Park Service, and I know it was true when we were there, does a very good job at making the case for what the basic budget needs are, not an excess of needs. So yep, it seems like cutting in that way is penny wise and of course pound foolish, because at the end of the day, resources are compromised, visitation is compromised, the national parks are compromised. So in the long run, it seems like you're doing a great disservice. Do they have any answer for that at all?
Not really. You know, what the Park Service is really great, and you can probably speak to this better than I can, is that they want to do great for the resources and for the visitors, and so they do the best they can. They overwork. The superintendents and the other park rangers are wearing many hats. They're welcoming visitors into the overcrowded parking lots, but they're also trying to protect the resources. They're trying to educate the visitors. So if you look at it from a visitor perspective, the parks are doing great. But if you really peel back a layer, the wastewater system needs to be replaced. The roof is leaking at the visitor center. The resources, the cultural and natural resources are being impacted. And so we try to paint that picture with Congress about no, really, they're really suffering, and they really need these resources because we're not going to have these resources forever if we don't protect them. So we continue to hammer that message with them. And it is resonating, like I said, with some offices because they have been fighting back on some of these cuts. But we have to continue to be up there on Capitol Hill, pushing them to do the right thing.
Well, speaking of peeling back the layers, and I think you began to touch on it, the impact that this has upon employees. I mean, there was a recent report from Peer and I think another independent organization that showed a very low ranking of the National Park Service amongst all government agencies that looked at employee satisfaction and other things. I mean, the National Park Service was near the bottom. And I think you can trace some of that back to the fact that there's not a lack of funding because there is a lack of funding. Because as you pointed out, the superintendents, the rangers, whether they're resource rangers, law enforcement rangers, interpretive rangers, are all wearing many different hats. They're overworked. There's not adequate park housing. And all of this ends up impacting park morale. And unfortunately, I knew as deputy director, having to get involved in many personnel issues, that there's an ugly underbelly to the National Park Service where people are just very, very stressed, and you can trace it all back to not having adequate funding. How does Congress respond when you try to make that case, or do you try to make the case of pointing out the broader impact that this lack of funding has on the National Park Service?
We do. We talk about the impacts to the staff on these budget cuts and just the policies that may be harmful to the everyday life of the national park staff. One example is housing is a large issue, and it's not just in national parks. It's in a lot of communities where there's just not enough affordable housing for people in the Park Service, the Forest Service, the healthcare industry, the tourism industry. The pandemic certainly didn't help when people are now have the flexibility to live in these beautiful places or outside these beautiful places. And so the housing is unavailable or unaffordable. And so that is a big morale issue right now. One of many within the Park Service is people wanting to do these wonderful jobs, but are unable to find housing. And the housing that is available, some of it is in really bad disrepair. So that's part of that maintenance backlog of repairing the employee housing so that they can live near these parks and other public lands to be service to the visitors as well as protect these resources. So that's one example, and we do share that, and we are working with Congress to figure out what Congress can do to help in that particular situation. It's also probably internal to the Park Service that we're realizing. But one example would be like local hiring authority, allowing more flexibility for people that live near the parks to be able to get a hold of those jobs. And so you're both benefiting the local community with the jobs, but also they already have housing because they've lived there for a while. So that's just one example of some of the morale issues that are really impacting the staff.
Understand. Well, speaking of that, there was I'm sure you're aware, there was a recent anonymous $40 million grant to the National Parks Foundation to provide for park housing. How will that funding be monitored? I don't know if you know, and I know we hope to have Will Shafroth on the program, who, of course, heads up the National Parks Foundation. Will and I go back a long way, all the way to California when I was director of California State Parks. Will and I worked together, and his organization, of course, is doing a great job. But, a lot of times these organizations are given a lot of grant money, and you follow the money, and the intended purposes for the money just doesn't happen. So is that being monitored? Is NPCA aware of that? Are you looking at that at all?
We are aware of it. We heard about the announcement a couple of weeks ago. NPF is a great partner of ours. We work very closely with them, and we are working with them on the housing issue. We don't know how it's going to be monitored. We trust that the National Park Foundation, with a lot of their grants, will do exactly what they're supposed to do with it. And they have been really pushing, as well as NPCA and others, this housing crisis and the need to address it. So we're very excited that an anonymous donor was able to give some really wonderful, generous donation to help with this issue. So it'll be interesting to see how it's used. But the Park Service is also stepping up and trying to find solutions to help address the housing needs. And then, as I mentioned, we're working with Congress with NPF to try to figure out what legislative solutions there might be to help with the housing needs.
Right. So are there any real champions of parks in the Congress? Who are some of the members of Congress, both in the Senate and the House of Representatives, who champion parks and work very hard for them?
Yeah, we do have some good support. There is times that we can really get people together and just to go back in history a little bit, as I mentioned, in 2020, the Great American Outdoors Act had huge bipartisan support. What an effort. And it was not just NPCA, it was many, many partners. Pew
Yes.
Charitable Trust was the ringleader of all of it on the Legacy Restoration Fund. And then the LWCF Coalition and others. But the House vote was 310 to 107. Could you imagine that right now? Like, we don't see those votes right now. In the Senate, it was 73 to 25. Huge. And it was during the pandemic. And we were able to get this huge, huge bill through Congress that provided a lot of funding for our parks and our public lands. So we have some really great champs, both in the House and the Senate. And I could name a lot of them, but I will leave some of them out. But I will mention that Senator Portman from Ohio and Senator Alexander from Tennessee were some of our biggest champs. And I will also mention Mark Warner, who is still in the Senate, was also a big ringleader for us. So unfortunately, Senator Portman and Senator Alexander have retired. Good for them. We were sorry to see them leave because they were such great champs for the work that we're doing, particularly on park funding. So there is some room for someone and others to step into those shoes to help us push the extension of the Legacy Restoration Fund, which we are starting to work on, as well as appropriations and beyond. So there are quite a few champs out there, and we're starting to really resurface that, like I said, the Legacy Restoration Fund, and getting that extended for another 5 years, because more work needs to be done. And we are looking for some new champs now that those two senators have stepped down.
Yes, both of those are really giants in helping to protect our natural and cultural resources. I worked for a long time with Senator Portman and Senator Alexander. I just bring up their names again because often the names of good people like that are forgotten. Nobody remembers the work that they did. And Senator Alexander and Portman, two great Republican senators, did a great job on behalf of the parks and all federal lands and our natural and cultural resources. I hope they're not forgotten. I hope history remembers the work that they did. So I know that several years now, NPCA has highlighted the economic benefits of parks, but I haven't heard much about the health and psychological well-being of parks. Do you plan to change your strategy at all in trying to get Congress and the public to understand the importance of parks in that context of our health and well-being? I think it's a really important part, and in fact, when parks were first championed, and people in the early days in the 1915, 1916, 17 era, they really went out of their way to talk about the health and psychological benefits of parks. What does NPCA think about that?
Yes, we do message about that, and it's getting more and more traction because doctors are starting to see the benefits of, say, children out, and they actually prescribe going outdoors to people that need a recharge and are having, difficult times. And also, the Department of Veterans Affairs is also looking at the benefits of the veterans really benefiting from being outdoors and some of these landscapes that are very quiet and can recharge their batteries. So we are talking more and more about that and trying to share those benefits more and more as we're talking to Congress and our partners and others about the importance of these places. I think it was really eye-opening for people during the pandemic as we were all facing those issues and we were stuck in our homes, how important the outdoors are. And also, we always talk about the outdoors, but also just the historic places and cultural places that we have in the national park system as well, to remember our history. So all of those places can be really, really beneficial to people. So continuing to share that message for sure.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned our historical and cultural resources because they do provide for inspiration for people, not just in the United States, but all over the world, even visitors who come here and see the history of the United States, whether they're at the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site or they're visiting the home of Frederick Douglass. It doesn't matter. I mean, they are all inspired, no matter their background, to understand and get a clear picture of the history of this country and its development. We often look at our iconic parks like Yosemite and Yellowstone and sometimes forget these wonderful historic resources that we have. I appreciate you mentioning that. Emily.
And on that note, is that, we have a big opportunity coming up. America is turning 250 years old. What an exciting time exciting and just a time to reflect on our history, right? We've got some dark periods too, but national parks really highlight a lot of our history through our nation. And so we're putting it on Congress and working with Congress to find a great way for them to get involved in the 250th anniversary of this nation and putting it in and challenging them to put some more resources in our cultural and historic resources and the staff that protect those resources as we enter the 250th year of this nation. So we're looking at this divisive time in Congress. Parks can bring people together from both sides of the aisle. And so using these opportunities and showing the connection with our national parks and how they can be a part of restoring these places for our next 250 years. So we're working on that as well as we head into the next couple of years.
That's great. Well, Emily, the last question I have for you is one we always wrap up with, and that's looking back on your life and your journey. Was there one seminal occurrence that was transcendent that changed your life or changed your direction, or put you hard onto this journey that you're on right now? Can you think of any moment, or were there a collection of moments?
There's a collection of moments, but I'm going to highlight just one in particular, and I almost brought it up earlier, is when you were talking about Senator Portman. When I started with NPCA, I was charged with developing this coalition and then working on the Park Service Centennial Bill. And not just me, but we worked with NPF and we worked with the Park Service to understand their needs and so forth. But, we were getting to the end of the congressional session. And as you know, when you get to the end, if your bill hasn't passed, you have to start essentially over in the next Congress. Yes. Senator Portman sat on the Senate floor and would not leave until the Centennial Bill passed. It was the last piece of legislation that passed that Congress at the end of the Congress or the administration as well. So Director Jarvis was, instrumental in putting together a proposal for the Park Service for their centennial, and NPCA and others took that proposal and we pushed it and tweaked it as well, in advocating for some really great programs, including the Park Service endowment, to establish and put aside money in an endowment that will raise money over time, as well as and you may be familiar with this, Donald, is the Centennial Challenge, public-private partnership that was actually started by Senator Portman when he was OMB director under the Bush administration, and taking that and making it legislative, so that money goes into it so that we can have public-private partnership to address maintenance needs or education programs. So a lot of the Friends groups really benefit from that public-private partnership opportunity where they can raise some of the money, and then the federal government matches that funding to do some really great programming for the parks. So that was a really great moment to see that we could get that done. We had some really great champs that were going to fight for their piece of legislation, and that led to Portman and others joining together to do the Great American Outdoors Act. And so it was just a line of successes in trying to protect our national parks. And so that was a really great moment to watch all of that and to continue that movement to get more done for the parks.
Well, that's good to know. Well, I can't say enough. I know I've mentioned Senator Portman over and over again. I hope somebody writes a little pamphlet or book about all the things that he did for National Park Service, but not just for National Park Service, but for the cultural and historical resources of the United States of America. I mentioned that when I left the National Park Service, I became president and CEO of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. Of course, Ohio was one of the states that was right in the middle of everything that happened during the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad. And Senator Portman was responsible for getting a $15 million appropriation to help establish the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. And he worked on many issues like that on behalf of the American people. And yeah, we're all sad to see him go, and I hope somebody does write a little pamphlet one day that would memorialize all the things that he's done for national parks. Emily, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I love your smile and your enthusiasm, and the National Parks Conservation Association and national parks are in good hands with you and others at the helm. I appreciate you joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
All right. You take care and have a great rest of the day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. What a great discussion about our national parks with Emily. If you want to continue to support our national parks, you can contact NPCA at npca.org and learn all about their efforts. You can also donate at npca.org. On our next episode, we'll have John Jarvis, the former director of the National Park Service. He'll be here to share some of his ideas on the future of national parks and what we can do to permanently fund the national parks and secure its future for this and future generations. In the meantime, stay safe, share happiness, and remember, never stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing.